The grand candor of the game mansion sparkled above you, but nothing could brighten the heaviness sitting in your chest. You had spent all afternoon preparing the dinner table, hoping maybe, just maybe Taehyung would notice you tonight. Instead, it was his sister's sharp voice cut through the air. Do you really think my brother married you out of love, Wine? She said, her lips curled into a cruel smile as she set down her wine glass. Don't be naive, you are just a business deal. Your hand froze around the serving spoons for a moment. You thought you had misheard her, but her laughter confirmed it wasn't some mistake. Your throat tightened. What did you just say? You whispered through part of you didn't want the answer. She leans closer, smirking. My brother never wanted this marriage. Our father pushed it. It benefited the company, the family name. Don't mistake his silence for affection. You are nothing to him. The words were knives, and they cut deeper because they carry the weight of truth. Hasn't he himself never once smiled at you since the wedding? Hadn't he always kept his distance, treating you more like a stranger? You excuse yourself quickly, blinking back, the tears threatening to fall. At dinner, you sat snipping cross from Taehyung. He was, as he's always, cold, unreadable eyes fixed on his plate or his phone. Is something wrong? You are softly testing, almost hoping the would deny his sister what. Taehyung looked up briefly, his expression as distinct as ever. No, eat your food. Just like that, no warmth, no reassurance, just a command that covers the last bite of hope you held. Time skip. That night, the silence between you stretched endlessly. You drawn your back to him as you lay in the bed, biting your lips to stop the sob, but the dam broke. Anyway, you couldn't hold them in. The tears slid down your cheeks silently. Turning slowly, you burning your face into his chest, muffling your cries. Why? Why did you marry me if I mean nothing? You whispered, thinking he was deep asleep. I try so hard, but I am just a deal to you, ain't I? Your finger colored into the fabric of his shirt as your soap shook you. His eyes were wide open in the darkness. He didn't move, didn't breathe too loud, but his heart hammered painfully against his ribs as your tears choked through his shirt, and for the first time in a year, Tim felt guilt. The morning after your tear had soaked his shirt, you wake up with swollen eyes. You avoid him gaze as you slipped out of the bed before he could say anything. He was still lying there, one arm stuck behind his head, staring at the ceiling with unreadable eyes. He remembered every word you had whispered in the dark. Why did you marry me if I mean nothing? If it's in his mind like a broken record, a voice he couldn't silence. At breakfast, you sat quietly at the table, serving food like always. Your movements were mechanical now, not like before when you tried to smile at him, hoping to get even a flickering of the warmth in return. Eat something too, then muttered, surprised himself the word. You froze mid-motion, blinking at him. He didn't usually care whether you ate or not. But when you looked up, his expression was blank again, his eyes fixed on the newspaper in his hand as if the word hadn't left his mouth. I am not hungry, you whisper, but then you notice the way your finger trembling as you pour coffee, the way your lips press together to stop the quenching. He notices everything now. At the office, the afternoon Taehyung sat in his office, unable to concentrate. His assistant was briefing him a quantity report when a few employees outside whispering, not realizing the door was silently ajar. Poor Mrs. Kim, she tries so hard, but the boss doesn't even look at her. She's just a contract wife. Everyone knows it's a business marriage. Taehyung penny snapping his head, his assistant froze as the CEO stood abruptly staring at the door. Who said that? His voice was sharp, low, and dangerous. Two employees paled, stammering, apologizing. If I ever hear you speak about my wife again, he groaned, you will be out of this company before you can blink. Do I make myself clear? The office went silent. Even his assistant looked shocked, not at his anger, but the word